I married a dying billionaire to save my brother. But his loyal assistant was poisoning him right in front of me. The rain hammered against the hospital window like it was trying to break in, turning the world outside into a smeared gray mess. I sat alone in the sterile waiting room, my hands knotted so tightly in my lap that my knuckles ached, staring down at the endless stack of medical bills glowing on my phone screen. My little brother Lucas was in the ICU, machines breathing for him after that horrible car crash. His life was hanging by the thinnest thread, and somehow mine was too. I'm just an art teacher. I've never had much, but I've always managed. Until now. I'd already sold everything I could think of. My beat-up old car, the few pieces of jewelry I owned, even the antique vase that had belonged to our grandmother. It still wasn't enough. The hospital wanted the full amount up front for the experimental treatment that might actually save him, and those cold numbers kept climbing higher, mocking me. Tears burned behind my eyes. I pressed my lips together and whispered into the empty room. How am I supposed to do this alone? The rain outside felt like it was falling inside me too. Endless, suffocating, washing away every last scrap of hope. Lucas was all I had left. Our parents had died years ago in that stupid boating accident, and since then it had just been the two of us against the world. No savings, no rich relatives, no safety net, just me, failing him. That was when I noticed the man. He moved quietly, almost too smoothly, across the linoleum floor. Sharp suit, polished shoes that clicked with purpose, and a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He introduced himself as Daniel Reed, personal assistant to Victor Hale. The Victor Hale, the reclusive billionaire who owned Ether Dynamics, the tech giant everyone talked about but no one really knew. "Miss Moore," he said in that calm, practiced voice, sliding a thick cream business card across the low table between us. "My employer has a proposition for you, one that could resolve all of your current difficulties." I stared at him, not sure I'd heard right. He didn't waste time. He laid it out cleanly, like he was reading from a script. Victor Hale was dying. Terminal illness, months, maybe less. He needed a wife, on paper only, for appearances, for legal reasons, for whatever rich people need when they're running out of time. In exchange, every single one of Lucas's medical bills would be paid immediately. The experimental treatment, the ICU stay, future care, everything. And when Victor passed, I would inherit enough money to never worry again. It sounded insane, immoral, like something out of a bad movie. But the rain kept pounding, louder now, drowning out every rational thought. I looked down at the phone again, at the red past due alerts, at the photo I kept as my lock screen of Lucas grinning at me from last summer, sunburned and laughing, and something inside me cracked. Family or pride? Lucas's life or my principles? Survival or shame? I felt the weight of it pressing down on my chest until I could barely breathe. Daniel Reed just waited, patient, unblinking, like he already knew what my answer would be. And deep down, so did I. The wedding wasn't a wedding at all. It was a transaction dressed up in legal language that held in a dimly lit conference room on the top floor of Ether Dynamics headquarters. No white dress, no flowers, no music, no friends or family, just a bored-looking notary public, a stack of documents so thick it felt like signing my life away chapter by chapter, and the low hum of the air conditioning. I stood there in a plain black dress I'd bought off the rack the day before, because nothing else felt right. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the pen when it was my turn to sign. Elena Moore became Elena Hale on paper, right next to Victor Hale's shaky, barely legible signature. They wheeled him in last. Victor looked exactly like the tabloid photos I'd seen online. Pale skin stretched tight over sharp cheekbones, dark circles under his eyes, thin lips pressed into a line. The high-tech wheelchair he sat in probably cost more than my entire apartment, but it only made him look smaller, more fragile. He didn't smile. He didn't even really look at me. His gaze drifted somewhere past my shoulder, like I was just another piece of furniture in the room. Daniel Reed stood off to the side, arms folded, watching everything with that same cool, detached expression he'd worn at the hospital. When the notary declared it official, Daniel stepped forward and handed me my copy of the contract like he was passing me a receipt. "Congratulations, Mrs. Hale," he said, the smirk in his voice so faint I almost missed it. Victor finally spoke. His voice was thin, raspy, barely above a whisper. "This is purely business. Don't expect more." I nodded once, throat tight. What was there to say? The money had already hit the hospital account. I'd checked on my phone in the elevator on the way up. Lucas's surgery was scheduled for first thing tomorrow morning. That was the only thing that mattered. We exchanged rings next. 2 plain platinum bands, cold as ice when they slid onto our fingers. No vows, no kiss, no applause, just the scratch of the notary's pen finalizing it all. They wheeled Victor out first. He didn't say goodbye, didn't look back. The door closed behind him with a soft click, and suddenly the room felt too big, too quiet. I stood there alone, staring at the heavy contract in my hands, the weight of the new ring foreign and wrong on my finger. I'd just married a stranger, a man I'd barely spoken 10 words to for money, for Lucas, for survival. I thought about the rumors I'd read. Victor Hale, tech prodigy, orphan. A recluse, genius who'd built an empire from nothing and was now dying from some unnamed illness the doctors gave him months, maybe less. The contract was clear. I was to play the part of the devoted wife in public when required, live in his house, keep up appearances until the end came. After that, I'd walk away with more money than I could ever spend. It should have felt like a lifeline. Instead, it felt like I'd just sold a piece of my soul. I slipped the contract into my bag and walked out of that cold office, heels clicking on marble, wondering what kind of man I'd just tied myself to, and how long it would take before the lie we were living started to crack. I had no idea then how deep the deception really ran. The Hale mansion felt more like a mausoleum than a home. It sat on the edge of the city, all pale marble and sharp angles, sprawling under a sky that never quite seemed to touch it. I moved in the day after the wedding, dragging my 2 small suitcases behind me like they were apologies. My entire life fit inside them. Clothes, a few sketchbooks, some brushes, a couple of framed photos of Lucas and me from better days. They looked ridiculous next to the endless polished floors and vaulted ceilings that swallowed every sound. Crystal chandeliers dangled overhead like frozen rain, catching the light but giving off no warmth. Every room I passed felt staged, perfect furniture no one ever sat in, books no one ever read, paintings too expensive to enjoy. It was beautiful in the way graveyards sometimes are, quiet, expensive, and completely lifeless. I walked the long corridors in my socks so my footsteps wouldn't echo too loudly. I'd half convinced someone would appear at any moment and demand to know why I was trespassing in my own supposed home. That first afternoon, I was standing in the foyer trying to decide which hallway led to the kitchen when she appeared. Mrs. Whitmore. She was small and silver-haired, dressed in a neat gray uniform, but her eyes were soft and her smile felt like the first real thing I'd seen since signing that contract. She carried a tray with a steaming teapot and 2 cups. "Welcome, dear," she said, voice gentle enough to make the word feel true. "You must be exhausted. Come, let's have some tea. Mr. Hale doesn't entertain often. Oh, but I'll make sure you're looked after." I followed her to a smaller sitting room I hadn't noticed before, one with actual sunlight coming through the windows and cushions that looked like they'd been sat on at least once in the last decade. She poured the tea without fuss and handed me a cup. It was warm in my hands, grounding. Over the next few days, Mrs. Whitmore became the only person I really spoke to. She didn't pry, but she talked easily, filling the silence with small stories. She told me Victor had lost his parents in a plane crash when he was barely 20. No siblings, no close relatives. He'd poured every ounce of grief into building ether dynamics, working 18-hour days, sleeping in the office, turning ideas into billions. But the empire grew while the man shrank. No friends, no lovers, just work. And now this illness that was supposed to end it all. "He's a good man," she said one evening while we sat in the kitchen. She insisted I call it the kitchen even though it was bigger than my old apartment. Just broken in places most people never see. I started noticing Victor more after that. Late at night or early in the morning when the house was still dark, I'd catch glimpses of him through the half-open door of his study. He sat hunched in that sleek wheelchair, surrounded by floating holographic screens, blue light washing over his sharp features as he manipulated streams of code and quantum models with gestures that looked almost painful. He never looked up. Never acknowledged me standing there in the doorway like some ghost he didn't want to see. The mansion was so vast, it felt like it was built to keep people apart. Every empty room, every long hallway, every closed door seemed to mirror the distance between us. And yet, watching him work in that cold blue glow, seeing how small he looked against all that technology he'd created, something shifted inside me. For the first time since I'd signed my name next to his, I didn't just feel resentment or obligation. I felt pity. A small, reluctant seed of empathy took root somewhere deep, right in the middle of this cold, contractual arrangement we'd both agreed to. I didn't know what to do with it yet, but it was there. Victor started fading faster than anyone expected. It wasn't gradual anymore. One morning I walked past his study on my way to the kitchen and saw him slumped sideways in the wheelchair, head lolling against the high backrest, chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven jerks. His skin looked waxy under the morning light filtering through the blinds. I stopped in the doorway. "Victor?" He stirred, slowly, like the movement cost him everything. His eyes cracked open. "I'm fine," he rasped, lifting a trembling hand to wave me off. The words sounded rehearsed, brittle. I didn't move. "You don't look fine." He let out a short, humorless breath that might have been a laugh if he'd had the strength. "I don't want doctors. I don't want hospitals. I don't want to drag this out any longer than it has to be." His voice cracked on the last word, raw with something that sounded a lot like surrender. "Let it happen." I stood there, helpless, watching him force himself upright again like nothing had happened. But something had. I could see it in the way his shoulders stayed hunched even after he straightened. Based the way his hands shook when he reached for the controls on the armrest. That night, it got worse. I was in my room, half asleep with a book open on my chest, when I heard it. A heavy metallic crash from down the hall, followed by a choked gasp that cut straight through me. I threw the covers off and ran barefoot across the cold marble. His study door was ajar. Inside, the holographic screens were still glowing faintly, casting blue ghosts across the floor. Victor lay sprawled beside the overturned wheelchair, one arm twisted awkwardly under him, the other clutching at his chest. His breathing was wet and ragged, like he was drowning in the air itself. "Victor!" I dropped to my knees beside him, hands hovering, not sure where to touch without hurting him more. His eyes found mine, wide, panicked, human in a way I'd never seen before. No mask, no billionaire armor, just a man who was terrified and running out of time. "Help!" he managed, the word barely a whisper. I shouted for Mrs. Whitmore. My voice cracked the silence of the house like glass. She appeared almost immediately, calm but moving fast, an oxygen mask already in her hands. She knelt on his other side, fitting the mask over his face while I held his free hand, cold, bony fingers curling weakly around mine. I didn't let go. Not when the paramedics arrived, not when they lifted him onto the stretcher, not even when the ambulance doors closed and the red lights flashed away down the long driveway. I stood in the foyer in my pajamas, still holding the ghost of his grip, my heart hammering so hard it hurt. In that moment, something broke open inside me. I'd signed a contract to be his wife on paper. I'd told myself this was temporary, transactional, a means to an end. But kneeling on that floor, feeling the frantic flutter of his pulse under my thumb, I couldn't pretend anymore. He wasn't just the dying billionaire. He was Victor, alone, frightened, fighting something bigger than money or power or pride. After that night, I couldn't go back to keeping my distance. I started checking on him, quietly at first, bringing a tray with tea and toast when he skipped meals, sitting in the armchair across from his desk while he worked, not speaking unless he did. Sometimes he'd glance up, surprised, like he hadn't expected anyone to stay. Other times he'd just let the silence sit between us, comfortable in a way it hadn't been before. The contract hadn't changed, but we had. What started as obligation was slowly turning into something else, something fragile, human, and terrifyingly real. A connection built in the shadow of death, inching forward one small, careful step at a time. I didn't know how much longer he had, but for the first time, I found myself hoping it would be longer than the doctors said. Days slipped into weeks, and something quiet began to change between us. We started talking, really talking, in the sunlit conservatory at the back of the house. The glass walls let in golden afternoon light that made the potted ferns and orchids look almost alive, and for the first time, the mansion didn't feel quite so hollow. Victor would wheel himself in after his work sessions, and I'd already be there with 2 cups of tea or sometimes just sitting with my sketch pad, pretending to draw while I waited for him. He told me about his dreams, not the polished press release version, but the real ones. How he wanted quantum computing to crack problems no one else could touch, clean energy that actually worked, cures for diseases we still called incurable, ways to feed cities without destroying the planet. His voice would get stronger when he talked about it, eyes bright even when the rest of him looked so fragile. It was never about the money, he said once, staring out at the garden. It was about leaving something behind that mattered. I found myself opening up in return. I told him about art school, the late nights in the studio smelling of turpentine and possibility, how I'd dreamed of my own gallery one day, and how I'd quietly packed all of that away when Lucas needed me, first after our parents died, then after the accident. I didn't mean to sound bitter. I just wanted him to understand why I was here, why I'd said yes to the contract in the first place. One afternoon, he looked at me for a long moment, really looked, and said softly, "You've spent your whole life sacrificing for other people. When this is over, promise me you'll live for yourself. Paint the world you deserve." I laughed. Actually laughed, because the idea felt so impossibly far away and yet so kind coming from him. The sound bounced off the glass and warmed the room like sunlight. I reached over and squeezed his hand. "Only if you promise to fight a little harder. See another doctor. Try the new trials they keep mentioning." He gave me that small, tired half smile. "We'll see." He never agreed outright, but he never pulled away either. Those afternoons became something I looked forward to. Stolen glances across the room when he thought I wasn't watching. The way our fingers brushed when I handed him a cup, and neither of us moved to break the contact right away. Shared, quiet laughter over nothing important. It was slow, careful, the way a painting builds, layer after transparent layer until suddenly there's depth you didn't plan for. I started dreading the mornings I'd wake up and remember how little time the doctors said he had left. My heart would twist in a way my brain kept trying to argue with. This wasn't supposed to happen. This was a job, a deal, a temporary arrangement. But every time I sat with him, every time he looked at me like I was the only real thing in his world, the lie I'd been telling myself grew thinner. I was falling in love with a man who was supposed to die. And the quiet we'd built felt so precious precisely because I knew a storm was coming. Suspicion didn't arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, like fog rolling over the city until you realize you can't see the skyline anymore. It started with the pills. Victor took them every day at the same times, small white capsules that Daniel Reed delivered personally in little amber bottles with typed labels. Daniel handled everything medical: the prescriptions, the deliveries, the progress reports. He occasionally shared with Victor in private. I'd never questioned it before. Why would I? Daniel was the efficient, ever-present assistant who made the impossible parts of Victor's life run smoothly. Then one evening I was emptying the small wastebasket in Victor's study, something I'd started doing without thinking, just to feel useful, and I saw an empty bottle at the bottom. The label was different. No pharmacy name I recognized, no doctor's signature, just a string of numbers and a barcode. I turned it over in my hand, frowning. Why would the label look so generic? My stomach twisted. The next morning, I waited until Daniel had left for his usual errands and slipped 3 of the capsules from the current bottle into my pocket. I told Victor I was running into the city to pick up some art supplies. He nodded absently, already lost in his screens. I drove to an old classmate's pharmacy on the quieter side of town, someone discreet who wouldn't ask too many questions. I laid the pills on the counter. "Can you tell me what these are?" He examined them under the light, ran a quick test strip, checked something on his computer. When he looked up, his face was grim. "These aren't standard medication," he said quietly. "The active compound is a synthetic cardiac suppressant, slow-acting. Over weeks or months, it would induce progressive heart failure in someone already weakened. If he's been taking these regularly..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. I left the pharmacy in a daze, the bottle burning a hole in my pocket. From then on, everything about Daniel looked different. He was always there, hovering just outside rooms, checking Victor's vitals himself instead of calling a nurse, answering calls in low, clipped tones when he thought no one was listening. One night I passed the library and caught him on the phone. Back to the door. "Everything's under control. He's declining exactly as projected. No deviations." The words landed like ice water down my spine. I started watching him more closely, noticing how he controlled the delivery of the pills, how he discouraged Victor from seeing outside specialists, how his smile never quite reached his eyes when he spoke to me. The quiet routine we'd built, tea in the conservatory, late-night talks, suddenly felt fragile, watched. My mind raced with questions I didn't want to face. Why was Victor getting worse so fast when the doctors had said months, not weeks? Why did Daniel insist on handling every aspect of his care personally? And the worst one, the one that kept me awake staring at the ceiling. What if the pills weren't meant to treat anything at all? What if they were the reason he was dying? The peaceful days we'd carved out were gone. In their place was a tightening thread of dread, a growing certainty that the real danger wasn't Victor's illness. It was the man who was supposed to be saving him. The pharmacist's words hit me like a physical blow. I stood frozen behind the counter while he repeated it, slower this time, as if he knew I needed to hear it twice to believe it. "These aren't therapeutic," he said, tapping the pill bottle I'd handed him. "The compound is a synthetic cardiac toxin, slow release. It mimics the progression of heart failure, fatigue, shortness of breath, arrhythmias, building over weeks or months until the heart simply gives out. If your husband has been taking these daily..." He trailed off, eyes full of quiet sympathy. "He's not dying from an illness. Someone is killing him." My knees almost buckled. Victor wasn't terminally ill. He was being poisoned. And the person who'd been handing him the pills every single day, the person who controlled every aspect of his medical care, was Daniel Reed. I drove back to the mansion in a haze, hands shaking on the wheel, replaying every moment I'd trusted Daniel. His calm explanations at the hospital, the way he'd smoothly delivered the contract, how he'd always been there with the next bottle, the next update, the next assurance that everything was progressing as expected. I felt sick. When I walked through the front door, the house was quiet except for the low hum of Victor's study down the hall. I didn't go to him first. I went straight to the library where Daniel was working at the long table, papers spread out like he owned the place. He looked up when I entered, expression polite. "Elena, you're back early." I didn't sit. I didn't bother with pleasantries. "I know what the pills are," I said. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. "They're not medicine. They're poison. You've been poisoning him." For one long second, the mask didn't slip. Then something cold and amused flickered across his face. He leaned back in the chair, folding his arms. "You've been busy. Tell me why." He studied me like I was an interesting specimen. Then he shrugged. One small, careless movement. "Victor was brilliant once," he said. "But he's been fading for years. Weak, indecisive. The board's been restless. Ether dynamics needs strong leadership, not a dying man clinging to outdated dreams." His lips curved. "When he passes, quietly, naturally, no one will question it. The shares, the patents, the voting rights, they transfer to me. I've earned it. I've carried him for a decade." I stared at him, bile rising in my throat. "You're murdering him for a company." "I'm saving the company," he corrected, almost gently. "And you were supposed to be the perfect cover. The grieving widow who inherits nothing because the will was already rewritten in my favor months ago. Simple, clean." My pulse roared in my ears. I backed toward the door. "You're wrong about one thing." He raised an eyebrow. "I'm not going to let him die." I turned and ran, first to Victor's study. He was awake, pale, working on something holographic that flickered weakly. When he saw my face, the screens dimmed. "Elena? What? No time," I gasped. "The pills! They're poison! Daniel's been poisoning you! We have to get you to the hospital now!" His eyes widened, but he didn't argue. He just nodded once. The trust flickering in them like something fragile and new. I grabbed my phone, dialed emergency services while I helped him into a coat. "Attempted murder," I told the operator, voice shaking but clear. "My husband's been poisoned. We're at the Hale estate. Send police and an ambulance. Hurry." Mrs. Whitmore appeared in the doorway, face white. I didn't have to explain. She just moved, fetching oxygen, blankets, helping me wheel Victor toward the front door. Daniel stepped into the hall as we passed. He didn't try to stop us. He just watched, arms crossed, that same cold smile on his face. "You're making a mistake," he said softly. I met his eyes for 1 second. "No," I told him. "You are." The ambulance arrived before the police, lights flashing red and blue across the marble driveway. Paramedics took Victor gently, efficiently. I climbed in beside him, holding his hand the whole ride. His fingers were cold, but they squeezed mine back, weak but there. At the hospital, they moved fast. Blood work, tox screens, IV antidotes specifically matched to the compound the pharmacist had identified. Victor's vitals stabilized within hours. The doctors kept saying, "just in time," over and over like a prayer. By morning, the police had Daniel in custody. Evidence everywhere, records of the custom orders, encrypted emails, altered medical files. He'd been planning it for over a year. I sat beside Victor's bed as the sun came up, watching the color slowly return to his face. He looked at me through half-lidded eyes, voice rough from the tube they'd removed. "You saved me," he whispered. I shook my head, tears burning. "I almost didn't see it." "But you did." He reached for my hand again. "You chose to look." Everything had flipped. What started as a cold contract, a bought bride, a dying man, had become something else entirely. A fight, a rescue, a beginning. I wasn't the woman he'd paid for anymore. I was the one who'd refused to let him go. And in that sterile hospital room, with machines beeping softly around us, I realized our story wasn't ending. It was finally starting. The poison left his system faster than anyone expected. By the second day in the hospital, the gray pallor was gone from Victor's face. Color crept back into his cheeks, his breathing steadied, and when the nurses helped him sit up, he didn't waver. It was like watching someone wake up from a long, terrible dream. The doctors kept shaking their heads in quiet wonder. She repeating phrases like remarkable turnaround and textbook antidote response. I just sat beside the bed, holding his hand, feeling the warmth return to his fingers 1 degree at a time. They arrested Daniel that same afternoon. The police came to the hospital first, quiet, efficient, taking my statement in the hallway while Victor slept. Then they moved on to the mansion. By evening, the news was already leaking. Years of embezzled funds, falsified records, backdated documents that funneled company assets toward shell accounts in Daniel's name. Sabotage, too. Delayed patents, manipulated test results, subtle decisions that had quietly eroded Victor's control over ether dynamics for longer than anyone realized. The man who'd stood beside us at the fake wedding, who'd handed me the contract with that polite smirk. Heidi had been dismantling everything Victor built, piece by piece, while pretending to protect it. I didn't feel triumph when I heard, just a deep, bone-tired relief. Victor woke fully that evening. The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of the monitors and the city lights filtering through the blinds. He turned his head toward me slowly, eyes clearer than I'd ever seen them. "You didn't have to do it," he whispered, voice still rough from the ventilator they'd removed that morning. "You didn't have to save me. The contract didn't require it." I swallowed hard, tears stinging the backs of my eyes. "I know," I said. My voice came out small, trembling, but I wanted to. He studied me for a long moment, really looked, like he was seeing me for the first time without the fog of illness or suspicion between us. I've spent most of my life alone," he said quietly. "Even before the chair, before the supposed diagnosis. People wanted what I could give them, money, access, influence. No one ever stayed because they cared about the man behind the name." He paused, throat working. "Until you. You saw me at my weakest, and instead of walking away, you fought for me. You chose me." His hand tightened around mine. "I love you, Elena," he said, the words simple and certain. "Not because of the contract, not because you saved my life, because you made me remember what it felt like to want to keep living." The tears I'd been holding back finally spilled over. I leaned forward, resting my forehead against his, breathing him in, alive, real here. "I love you too," I whispered back. "I think I have for a while now. I was just too scared to admit it." He let out a soft, shaky laugh, the first real one I'd heard from him. "Then maybe we should stop being scared." The next morning, they let him stand. Not walk yet, just stand with support from the bed rail and a physical therapist on either side. But he stood, tall, steady, no longer the frail shadow in the wheelchair. When he looked at me across the room, there was fire in his eyes again. The same fire I'd glimpsed in those late-night holographic sessions before everything unraveled. He was ready to reclaim his life, and for the first time, I believed he wanted me in it. Not as a paid obligation, not as a temporary wife on paper, but as the woman he'd chosen. The man who was supposed to die had lived, and somehow impossibly so had the part of me that had forgotten how to hope. Once the poison was gone and the truth was out, there was nothing holding me here anymore. The contract was void the moment Victor's doctors confirmed he was no longer dying. No terminal illness, no ticking clock, no legal obligation for me to stay in that massive house, play the devoted wife, or wait for an inheritance that had never really been the point. I could have walked away, packed my 2 suitcases, gone back to my old apartment, picked up extra shifts at the school, and tried to pretend the last few months had been nothing more than a strange detour in my life. But I didn't. I stayed. Not because I had to. Not because of guilt or gratitude or the money still sitting untouched in the account Victor had set up for Lucas's care. I stayed because every morning when I woke up next to him, really next to him, no wheelchair between us, no shadow of death hanging over the bed, I wanted to be there. I wanted to see him stretch in the sunlight coming through the curtains, hear the quiet surprise in his voice when he realized I was still beside him. I wanted the slow mornings where we drank coffee in silence and the evenings where we talked until the city lights blurred outside the windows. Our bond grew in the quiet spaces the contract had never touched. No more pretending, no more pity, just two people choosing each other day after day, flaws and fears and all. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. Lucas had woken up. I was in the conservatory when Victor's phone rang. Mrs. Whitmore handed it to him with wide eyes, and I watched his face change as he listened. Then he looked at me and said the words I'd been praying for since the night of the accident. "He's awake, Elena. He's asking for you." We drove to the hospital together. Victor insisted on coming. No arguments. When we walked into Lucas's room, my brother looked pale and thin, but his eyes were open, clear, and when he saw me, he managed the smallest crooked smile. "Ellie," he croaked. "Took you long enough." I burst into tears and nearly climbed onto the bed to hug him. Victor stayed back, giving us space, but I felt him there, steady, quiet support. The recovery wasn't instant, but it was miraculous. Day by day, Lucas grew stronger. Physical therapy, speech sessions, endless tests. Through it all, Victor was there in ways I never expected, quietly covering costs no insurance would touch, arranging the best specialists, even sitting with Lucas sometimes when I had to step out, talking tech and video games like they'd known each other forever. A few months later, Lucas married Emily Carter. It was a small ceremony in a garden near the hospital. Nothing flashy, just sunlight, flowers, and the people who mattered. Lucas stood on his own 2 feet, shaky but proud, while Emily cried through her vows. I stood beside Victor, my hand in his, watching my little brother start the rest of his life. When the officiant said, "You may kiss the bride," Lucas leaned in carefully, and the small crowd, mostly hospital staff who'd become friends, Mrs. Whitmore, a few of Emily's family, erupted in cheers. Victor squeezed my hand. "He's going to be okay," he murmured. "So are we," I whispered back. The Moore family, small and battered as it was, began to heal. Old wounds I hadn't even realized were still bleeding slowly closed. Lucas and Emily moved into a little house not far from the city. I close enough for Sunday dinners. Victor and I visited often, and every time Lucas teased him about being the rich brother-in-law, Victor just smiled that quiet, real smile I'd come to love. I realized something important in those months. True love isn't about saving someone. It isn't a grand rescue or a noble sacrifice or even a dramatic reversal of fate. It's quieter than that. It's choosing someone every single day, even when there's no crisis forcing your hand. It's seeing their scars, their doubts, the parts of them that aren't easy or perfect, and deciding anyway, yes, you, still you, attention, care, the courage to question what everyone else accepts at face value. Those things can change everything. They changed us. And in the end, that was more than enough. Years passed, and somehow the world kept turning, brighter, fuller, kinder than I ever thought it could. Victor and I founded a medical research foundation together. It started small, a quiet donation in Lucas's name to fund experimental treatments like the one that had saved him. But it grew. We poured resources into rare diseases, cardiac conditions, anything that might spare another family the terror we'd lived through. Victor threw himself into it with the same fierce intelligence he'd once used to build ether dynamics. Only now the goal wasn't profit or power. It was time, second chances, lives that might otherwise slip away. I opened my own art studio downtown, a sun-drenched space with high windows and white walls that begged for color. My paintings changed. The dark, heavy pieces I'd made in the years after our parents died gave way to something else, vibrant, hopeful, alive. People started buying them. Galleries asked for shows. For the first time in my life, creating wasn't something I squeezed into the cracks of survival. It was the center, The mansion no longer felt like a mausoleum. We filled it slowly, deliberately. Books on every shelf, photographs on the walls, Lucas and Emily's wedding, our quiet civil ceremony a year later. No contracts this time, just vows we meant. Holidays with Mrs. Whitmore who'd become family in every way that mattered. Laughter echoed down the hallways now, real and unscripted. The emptiness had been replaced with warmth, with life. One evening, years after everything, rain began to fall again. I stood at the wide window in the living room, watching drops streak the glass. For so long, rain had meant despair to me. Cold hospital waiting rooms, impossible bills. The night Victor collapsed. But this time it felt different, soft, almost gentle. Victor came up behind me, arms sliding around my waist. He rested his chin on my shoulder, watching the same view. The clouds parted just enough. A shaft of late afternoon sun broke through, catching the rain in midair. Suddenly, the whole garden shimmered with color, faint, perfect rainbows arching over the lawn like someone had painted them there. "See?" Victor murmured, his voice low and warm against my ear. He pulled me closer. "Even storms can sparkle." I laughed softly, leaning back into him. "You're getting poetic in your old age. Only because you make it easy." We stood like that for a long time, wrapped in each other, watching the light play through the rain until the colors faded and the sky darkened again. But the feeling stayed. Our love wasn't the kind that burned hot and fast. It had grown slow, steady, tested by poison and fear and time. It was mature now, quietly enduring, rooted deep. A testament to second chances, to the simple, stubborn choice to keep showing up. The mansion that had once swallowed every sound now carried ours. Footsteps on the stairs, music from the kitchen, the low murmur of conversation late into the night. It was a home, finally, truly. And in that sparkling rain outside the window, our story found its end, not with tragedy or goodbye, but with healing, with peace, with the kind of quiet joy that doesn't need fireworks or grand declarations. Just us, together, still choosing each other, every single day.